The hardest person to stop loving is the one who never gave you a reason to leave, only a reason to stay. If you had asked anyone at Westbridge University to describe Mason Carter and me, they would have answered before you finished the question. We were best friends. Not the kind who only met for classes or weekend plans, but the kind who somehow became part of each other's daily routine without ever deciding it. We texted before breakfast, shared lecture notes without asking, and knew exactly which coffee order the other would choose before reaching the counter. Somewhere along the way, people stopped inviting one of us anywhere because they assumed the other was already coming. They were usually right. It had been that way for almost 8 years, beginning with an awkward freshman orientation where Mason accidentally spilled iced coffee across my notebook and spent the next 20 minutes apologizing while helping me rewrite every page. Most friendships fade after graduation, changing schedules, or new relationships, but ours only grew stronger with time. Mason was the kind of person everyone trusted. He remembered birthdays, drove friends to the airport at 5 in the morning without complaining, and somehow managed to make every room feel lighter simply by walking into it. People admired him because he never pretended to be anyone else. I admired him because I had seen every version of him, the confident one who could make strangers laugh, the exhausted one who fell asleep halfway through late-night movies, and the quiet one who carried worries he rarely shared with anyone. Somewhere between those ordinary moments, I fell in love with him. It was never dramatic. There were no fireworks, no grand realization, no movie soundtrack playing in the background. It happened one ordinary day after another until I woke up and realized the person I wanted to tell every story to had quietly become the center of every story I lived. The problem was painfully simple. Mason was straight. At least that was what everyone believed, including Mason himself. Because of that, I built invisible rules around my own heart. Never stare too long when he smiled. Never let your hand linger after a friendly high five. Never mistake kindness for love. Most importantly, never tell him the truth. Losing the chance to call him my best friend would have hurt far more than keeping my feelings hidden forever. So I became an expert at pretending. I teased him about dating apps even when every conversation left a small ache inside my chest. I encouraged him to ask girls out even though none of those relationships lasted very long. I celebrated every success in his life while quietly convincing myself that simply standing beside him was enough. Some days I almost believed it. Looking back now, I realize we were both living inside different versions of the same misunderstanding. I thought my silence was protecting our friendship. Mason thought my place in his life would never change because it had always been there. Neither of us understood that the strongest relationships are often transformed by the smallest moments, not by dramatic confessions or impossible choices, but by quiet seconds that seem completely ordinary while they are happening. At the time, the future looked wonderfully predictable. We had another semester ahead of us, another list of weekend plans, another Friday dinner at our favorite neighborhood diner, and another 1,000 ordinary conversations waiting to happen. I believed nothing could possibly change what we had built together. I had no idea that before the week was over, one ordinary ride home would quietly begin rewriting everything I thought I knew about friendship, love, and the person sitting beside me. The last train of the night was almost empty by the time Mason and I climbed aboard. The city outside had already settled into that quiet hour when office lights disappeared one floor at a time and the streets belonged mostly to delivery trucks, tired students, and people eager to get home. We had spent the entire day volunteering at a neighborhood community center before rushing across town to help one of our classmates finish a presentation that was due the following morning. By the time we finally found 2 seats near the back of the train, neither of us had enough energy left to pretend we were not exhausted. Mason dropped into the seat beside me with a long sigh and stretched his legs into the aisle. "I think I forgot what being rested feels like," he said with a tired smile. I laughed softly. "You say that every week." "Because every week you convince me to volunteer for something. You always say yes." He shrugged without opening his eyes. I have never been very good at saying no to you. The words were casual, almost playful, but they lingered in my thoughts longer than they should have. I reminded myself not to overthink them. Mason had always been generous with everyone. That was simply who he was. The train pulled away from the station, rocking gently as neighborhoods drifted past the windows in blurred streaks of yellow streetlights and glowing apartment buildings. We sat in comfortable silence, something we had perfected over years of friendship. There was never any pressure to fill every quiet moment with conversation. Sometimes we simply watched the city move around us while enjoying the rare chance to slow down together. I rested my backpack between my feet and glanced toward Mason. He was fighting to stay awake, rubbing one hand across his face before letting out another quiet yawn. "You should sleep when you get home," I said. "That is the plan." He smiled without opening his eyes. "Assuming I make it that far." A few minutes later the train eased through a wide curve, causing everyone inside to shift slightly with the motion. Mason leaned toward me instinctively, then straightened again. "Sorry," he mumbled. "You are fine." Another stop passed. More passengers stepped off until only a handful remained inside the car. The steady rhythm of the tracks filled the silence like a slow heartbeat. I turned my attention back to the dark window, watching our reflections drift across the glass. Without warning I felt a gentle weight against my shoulder. I looked down and found Mason asleep, his head resting naturally against me as though that had always been the most comfortable place in the world. His breathing settled into a slow, peaceful rhythm. A loose strand of dark hair had fallen across his forehead, softening the usually confident expression he carried through every day. For a brief moment he looked younger, free from deadlines, expectations, and the constant habit of taking care of everyone else before himself. My first instinct was to move so he could sit more comfortably. Instead I stayed perfectly still. I did not want to wake him. My shoulder would eventually become stiff, but that hardly seemed important. I quietly watched the reflections sliding across the window while the train carried us through the sleeping city, unaware that one ordinary ride home was only moments away from changing everything I believed about the life we had built together. The warmth of Mason resting against my shoulder should have felt ordinary after everything we had shared over the years. We had watched movies leaning against the same couch, fallen asleep during long road trips with friends, and laughed through countless late nights studying for exams. Yet somehow this moment felt different. Maybe it was because there was no audience, no distractions, no conversations to hide behind. There was only the quiet rhythm of the train, the dim lights above us, and the steady sound of Mason breathing peacefully beside me. I found myself memorizing small details I had never allowed myself to notice before. The faint crease near the corner of his eye that appeared whenever he smiled too much. The way one stubborn lock of hair refused to stay in place. The calm expression on his face that almost never appeared when he was awake because he spent so much of his life worrying about everyone else. I quickly looked away, embarrassed by my own thoughts. Loving someone in silence teaches you strange habits. You become careful about where your eyes linger. You learn to celebrate ordinary moments while pretending they mean nothing. You convince yourself that being close is enough because asking for more would risk losing everything. I had repeated those lessons for years until they almost felt true. The train slowed briefly before continuing through another quiet stretch of track. Mason shifted slightly in his sleep, and without opening his eyes, his hand reached across the small space between us. His fingers gently closed around the sleeve of my jacket as though searching for something familiar. My heartbeat immediately quickened. It was such a simple gesture that anyone else might have overlooked it completely. To me, it felt enormous. I stayed perfectly still, afraid that even the smallest movement would wake him. Then I noticed his expression change. His eyebrows drew together for only a second before relaxing again, as though he had been searching for someone in a dream and had finally found them. A barely audible whisper escaped his lips. At first I thought I had imagined it. The sound of the train almost swallowed the words before they reached me. Then he said them again, just clearly enough for me to understand. Do not leave me. My entire body froze. I stared straight ahead, unable to process what I had just heard. The words echoed through my mind again and again, refusing to disappear. I wanted to believe I had misunderstood, but hope has a dangerous way of disguising itself as certainty. Was he dreaming about someone else? Was he remembering a childhood memory? Was he simply talking in his sleep without meaning any of it? Every explanation sounded reasonable, yet none of them quieted the feeling growing inside my chest. I had spent years protecting myself from impossible expectations, reminding myself that kindness did not mean love and comfort did not mean romance. For quiet words had suddenly cracked every wall I had built around my heart. A few minutes later the familiar announcement for our station echoed through the train car. I gently spoke his name, careful not to startle him. Mason slowly opened his eyes, blinking with sleepy confusion before lifting his head from my shoulder. Did I fall asleep? He asked with an embarrassed laugh. Looks like I really was exhausted. I forced myself to smile as naturally as I could. You needed the rest. He stretched, completely unaware of what had happened while he slept, then picked up his backpack and walked beside me as we stepped onto the platform. He chatted about whether the neighborhood diner might still be serving pie before closing, smiling exactly as he always did. I answered every question, laughed at all the right moments, and followed him into the cool night air. Outwardly, nothing had changed between us. Quietly, everything had. The next morning I woke up hoping a full night of sleep would erase the memory of those 4 quiet words. Instead, they followed me into every ordinary moment like a song I could not stop hearing. While brushing my teeth, I remembered the way his voice had sounded. Walking across campus, I caught myself replaying the expression on his face while he slept. During lectures, I found my attention drifting away from the professor and back to that nearly empty train car. I hated myself for giving so much meaning to something Mason probably did not even remember saying. Hope can be incredibly convincing when it has been starving for years. That afternoon my phone buzzed just as I finished class. Mason had already sent 3 messages. The first asked whether I wanted coffee. The second reminded me about an assignment that was not due until next week. The third simply read, "Where are you?" I smiled before I could stop myself. He had always checked in on me, but today there seemed to be an unusual urgency behind every message. When I finally met him outside the student center, he handed me my favorite iced coffee before I had the chance to order it. "You disappeared after class," he said. "I thought maybe you had gone home." "I was talking with my professor." "Good." He nodded once, looking oddly relieved. We spent the afternoon studying in the library, and I noticed something else that I could not ignore. Every time I stood up to grab another book or refill my water bottle, Mason instinctively looked up to see where I was going. If I wandered to another table, he would gather his things a few minutes later and quietly move closer without saying a word. None of it was dramatic. In fact, if someone else had been watching, they probably would not have noticed anything unusual. But after years of knowing him, I recognized every tiny change. I wanted to believe I was imagining it. I wanted to believe I had become overly sensitive because of one moment on the train. Yet the pattern continued over the following days. Mason started waiting outside my morning lecture even when his own class ended on the opposite side of campus. He insisted on walking me back to my apartment after evening study sessions despite adding almost 20 minutes to his own drive home. He even began calling instead of texting whenever I took longer than usual to answer my phone. Every new gesture created another question I could not answer. Was he simply being a better friend, or had something changed inside him without either of us realizing it? The uncertainty became even more confusing that Saturday when several friends invited us to the annual neighborhood food festival. We wandered between rows of local vendors, sampled homemade lemonade, and laughed over a musician who kept forgetting the lyrics to familiar songs. While Mason stepped away to buy barbecue sandwiches, a girl from my literature seminar recognized me and stopped to say hello. We talked for only a few minutes about an upcoming project before Mason returned carrying 2 paper trays of food. His smile was as warm as ever, but I noticed his eyes shift briefly from me to the conversation we had been having. "Ready to eat?" he asked. I nodded and thanked my classmate before following him toward a quieter picnic table. For the rest of the afternoon, Mason stayed unusually close. Whenever the crowd grew thicker, he gently guided me through the people without thinking, and every time someone tried to pull me into another conversation, he somehow appeared beside me again. I told myself friendship could explain every one of those moments. Deep inside, however, another possibility had quietly begun asking questions that neither my heart nor my mind was ready to answer. That night, after the food festival ended, I lay awake much longer than I wanted to admit. Every conversation, every glance, and every small gesture from Mason replayed inside my head with exhausting clarity. The logical part of me insisted I was reading too much into ordinary friendship. The emotional part quietly reminded me that people do not suddenly begin changing lifelong habits without a reason. I knew which side was safer to believe. By morning I had made a decision. I needed to stop letting hope guide my thoughts before. It destroyed the one relationship that mattered most to me. If Mason truly saw me as nothing more than his closest friend, then every expectation I created would eventually become my own heartbreak. The only way to protect both of us was to take a small step backward before my feelings became impossible to hide. It sounded simple in theory. In reality, I quickly discovered how much of my everyday life had quietly revolved around him. I stopped waiting outside his morning lecture and walked straight to the library instead. When he invited me to our usual Friday dinner, I told him I had too much reading to finish. The excuse was not completely false. I simply used my assignments as a place to hide. I answered his messages a little later than usual. I declined an invitation to watch a baseball game because I claimed I needed an early night. Every decision felt insignificant on its own, yet together they slowly created a distance that had never existed between us before. I kept telling myself this was the right thing to do. If I learned to stand on my own now, perhaps letting go someday would not hurt quite so much. Unfortunately, life rarely follows the plans we make to protect ourselves. 3 days later my apartment doorbell rang just after sunset. When I opened the door, Mason stood there holding 2 paper bags from our favorite neighborhood diner. He lifted them with a tired smile. "You missed Friday, so I figured Friday should come to you." I could not help smiling back. "You drove all the way over here just to deliver cheeseburgers?" "Not just cheeseburgers," he answered. I wanted to make sure my best friend had not decided to disappear. We carried the food upstairs and sat on the small balcony outside my apartment while the evening breeze drifted through the quiet neighborhood. For nearly an hour we talked about everything except the growing distance between us. We joked about a professor who always forgot students' names, debated whether pineapple belonged on pizza, and laughed over an old high school memory neither of us had thought about in years. For a little while, everything felt wonderfully familiar again. Then my phone lit up with a message from a classmate asking whether I wanted to join a graduate networking event the following weekend. I replied with a quick confirmation before setting the phone aside. Mason glanced toward the screen almost absent-mindedly. "Who was that?" he asked. "Someone from my marketing seminar," I answered. He hesitated for a brief second before speaking again. "The same girl you were talking to at the food festival?" I looked at him with genuine surprise. "Yes." "How did you remember that?" He looked away toward the street below, almost embarrassed by his own answer. "I guess I notice more than I used to." The sentence was quiet, almost accidental, yet it settled heavily between us. My heart wanted to ask why. My fear refused to let the question leave my lips. Instead, we finished dinner beneath the fading sunset, each of us carrying thoughts that neither one was brave enough to share. The conversation on my balcony stayed with me long after Mason drove home. His quiet admission that he had begun noticing more than he used to echoed through my thoughts in the same way those 4 whispered words had weeks earlier. I wanted to believe there was a connection between those moments, but experience had taught me that hope could turn ordinary kindness into imaginary promises if I was not careful. The safest choice was still the same. I had to protect our friendship, even if that meant continuing to ignore every sign that seemed to point somewhere impossible. The following week became a strange balance between distance and familiarity. I stopped creating obvious excuses to avoid him, yet I also resisted falling back into our old routines completely. Somehow Mason seemed to notice every tiny change. One afternoon, after my last lecture ended earlier than expected, I found him sitting alone on a bench outside the business building with 2 cups of coffee resting beside him. He looked up the moment I stepped outside, almost as though he had known exactly when I would appear. "I guessed your class would finish around now," he said, handing me my favorite drink before I could protest. "You guessed correctly." We started walking across campus together beneath rows of maple trees whose leaves had just begun turning shades of gold and red. Students hurried between buildings carrying backpacks, laughing about weekend plans, while the cool afternoon breeze hinted that summer was finally giving way to fall. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things, an upcoming economics exam, the baseball playoffs, and whether our favorite diner should finally add new desserts to the menu. The conversation felt effortless, yet beneath every word I sensed Mason studying me more carefully than before. Eventually he broke the comfortable silence. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He hesitated longer than usual before speaking. "Have I been bothering you lately?" I stopped walking and looked at him in surprise. "Why would you think that?" "Because something changed." His voice remained calm, but there was uncertainty behind it that I had never heard before. "You answer my messages later. You disappear more often. It feels like you are always one step farther away than you used to be." His honesty caught me completely off guard. I had believed I was creating only a little space, enough to protect my own heart without hurting his. Hearing him describe that distance made me realize he had felt every inch of it. "You did nothing wrong," I said quietly. "Then tell me what happened." I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to admit that one quiet moment on a train had left me questioning every certainty I had built over 8 years. Instead, I lowered my eyes and forced a small smile. "I have just been busy." He accepted the answer with a slow nod, but I could tell he did not believe it. We continued walking in silence until we reached the parking lot. Before unlocking his truck, Mason looked back at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Whatever it is," he said softly, "I hope you remember you do not have to carry it by yourself." As he drove away, I stood watching the empty parking space where his truck had been only moments earlier. The distance I had created was supposed to make letting go easier. Instead, every step I took away from Mason seemed to pull him closer, and for the first time I began to wonder if the person struggling to understand his own heart was no longer just me. For the next several days I could not shake the feeling that something invisible had shifted between us. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no emotional conversations, no unexpected confessions, and no obvious turning point. Yet every ordinary moment carried a quiet tension that neither of us seemed willing to acknowledge. Mason continued texting me every morning, asking whether I had eaten breakfast or reminding me not to forget assignments I had already finished. I answered every message, but I kept my replies shorter than before, hoping the distance would eventually become natural. Instead, it only made every interaction feel more important. On Friday afternoon, our department hosted the graduate networking event I had agreed to attend. The conference room buzzed with conversations between students, professors, and local business leaders. Everyone wore their best professional clothes and carried small paper cups of coffee while exchanging introductions and future career plans. I had barely finished speaking with one recruiter when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "There you are." I turned around and stared at Mason in complete surprise. "What are you doing here?" He rubbed the back of his neck with an awkward smile. My cousin works for one of the companies sponsoring the event. He invited me yesterday because they had extra guest passes. It sounded believable enough, but something about his expression told me there was more to the story. Throughout the evening we drifted between different conversations, occasionally separating before naturally finding each other again. At one point a senior marketing manager spent nearly 15 minutes talking with me about internship opportunities after graduation. Mason remained several feet away speaking with another group, yet every time I glanced across the room, I found his eyes briefly checking whether I was still there. When the event finally ended, we walked toward the parking garage together beneath the soft glow of streetlights. "How was your evening?" I asked. Mason laughed quietly. "Honestly? I spent most of it pretending to understand financial software demonstrations." I smiled. "Then why stay for 3 hours?" He looked ahead instead of at me. "Because someone important to me was here." My heart stumbled against my ribs. Before I could decide whether to respond, his phone suddenly rang. He answered after glancing at the screen. "Hey, Mom." His voice immediately softened. I politely stepped a few feet away to give him privacy while he spoke. The conversation lasted only a minute before he returned with an apologetic expression. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded. "My mother just wanted to remind me about dinner tomorrow." We reached our cars, but neither of us unlocked the doors right away. The silence between us felt unusually heavy, as though both of us were waiting for someone to say the one thing that mattered. Finally Mason let out a slow breath. "Can I ask you one more question?" I nodded. "If I did something that accidentally hurt you, would you tell me?" I met his eyes and saw genuine concern staring back at me. There was no confusion, no frustration, only someone who desperately wanted to fix a problem he could not understand. My chest tightened with guilt. The person causing this distance had never been Mason. It had always been me. I forced another reassuring smile even though it felt painfully fragile. "You have never hurt me." He studied my face for a long moment, searching for something hidden beneath my words. Then he smiled gently, though it never quite reached his eyes. "I hope that is true." As we drove away in opposite directions, I realized neither of us had noticed the quiet truth unfolding between us. I had been trying to protect our friendship from my feelings, while Mason had been fighting just as hard to keep me from slipping out of his life, and neither of us yet understood that we were both afraid of losing exactly the same person. 2 days passed after the networking event before everything finally reached a point where neither of us could keep pretending nothing had changed. It happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon, the kind that usually belonged to grocery shopping, laundry, and catching up on assignments before another busy week began. Mason called just after lunch and asked whether I wanted to help him organize the storage room in his parents' garage. It sounded like the kind of favor I had agreed to 100 times before, so I said yes without thinking. By late afternoon we had sorted old camping gear, dusty boxes of childhood toys, and stacks of family photo albums that somehow kept distracting us from the work. Mason's parents eventually left to visit relatives, reminding us to lock up before we left. Suddenly the house became unusually quiet. We carried one last box into the garage before sitting on the driveway to rest. The autumn air was cool, carrying the familiar scent of fallen leaves and freshly cut grass from neighboring yards. Mason opened a bottle of water and handed it to me before staring toward the street with an expression I had not seen before. He looked thoughtful, almost uncertain. "Can I tell you something without you interrupting?" he asked. I nodded. He took a slow breath. "The last few weeks have been driving me crazy." I stayed silent. "You keep saying everything is fine, but I know you. I have known you for 8 years. I can tell when you are laughing because you are happy and when you are laughing because you want everyone else to believe you are happy." His words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. I lowered my eyes, unable to answer. "At first I thought you were stressed about school, he continued quietly. Then I thought maybe I had done something wrong. After that I started wondering whether you had met someone and just did not need me around anymore. I looked up immediately. That is not true. He gave a small, almost relieved smile. I was hoping you would say that. Another long silence settled between us. Neither of us seemed eager to be the first person to move. Finally Mason laughed softly at himself. You know what the worst part is? I shook my head. I never used to notice when you were gone for a few hours. Now if you do not answer my message, I check my phone every 10 minutes. He rubbed one hand across the back of his neck, clearly embarrassed by his own honesty. When you stopped waiting for me after class, campus suddenly felt a lot bigger. My heartbeat became impossible to ignore. Mason looked directly at me, his calm blue eyes carrying none of their usual confidence. I kept asking myself why it bothered me so much. He paused before letting out a slow breath. Then I remembered something I said to my mother a few nights ago. She asked why I seemed distracted all the time, and without thinking I told her I was afraid my favorite person was slipping away from me. He smiled sadly. She looked at me for about 5 seconds before asking why it had taken me so long to realize I was in love with my best friend. Time seemed to stop. Every sound from the neighborhood faded into silence until all I could hear was the steady beating of my own heart. Mason held my gaze without looking away, waiting not for an answer he expected, but for the truth only I could give. For a moment I could not find a single word. Every sentence I had imagined over the years disappeared the instant Mason admitted what I had spent so long believing could never be true. I searched his face for any sign that he was joking, confused, or simply caught up in an emotional moment, but all I found was quiet honesty. He was waiting patiently, giving me the same kindness he had shown me through every chapter of our friendship. I let out a slow breath and smiled in a way that felt completely different from all the smiles I had forced over the past few weeks. Do you remember the train ride after we volunteered at the community center? I asked softly. Mason frowned as he searched his memory. I remember falling asleep because I was exhausted. I nodded. You rested your head on my shoulder. He laughed awkwardly. I should probably apologize for that. Do not. I shook my head gently. You also said something before you woke up. His expression shifted with curiosity. What did I say? I held his eyes for a long second before answering. You whispered, "Do not leave me." Mason stared at me in complete surprise. I said that? Twice. He lowered his head and covered his face with one hand, letting out a quiet laugh filled with disbelief. I honestly do not remember any of that. I know. I smiled. But I remembered every single word. The silence that followed no longer felt heavy. Instead, it carried the strange peace that arrives when two people finally stop hiding from the truth. I looked down at my hands before speaking again. I spent years convincing myself that loving you quietly was enough. I never expected anything in return because I believed our friendship was too important to risk. After that night on the train, I started hoping for something I promised myself I would never hope for, and it terrified me. Mason listened without interrupting. That is why I pulled away, I admitted. Not because I wanted less of you. Because I was afraid I wanted more. Before I could say anything else, Mason reached over and gently took my hand. The gesture was simple, familiar, and completely natural, yet it somehow carried every feeling we had failed to express for so many years. You know what I finally realized? He asked quietly. I shook my head. Every time something good happened, you were the first person I wanted to tell. Every time something went wrong, you were the only person who could make me believe everything would be all right. I kept calling that friendship because I had never stopped long enough to ask myself why nobody else ever made me feel the same way. I laughed through the sudden warmth gathering behind my eyes. You really took your time figuring it out. He smiled with the same gentle expression that had made me fall in love years earlier. Apparently I did. We stayed there until the first porch lights began glowing across the neighborhood and the evening sky slowly filled with stars. There was no dramatic celebration, no perfect movie ending, only two best friends choosing honesty after years of silence. A few weeks later we found ourselves riding the same evening train home after another volunteer event. This time, when exhaustion finally caught up with Mason, he smiled before resting his head on my shoulder. I smiled back without a trace of doubt. Just before drifting to sleep, he whispered with a sleepy laugh, "I am not going anywhere." I quietly intertwined my fingers with his and looked out at the lights passing beyond the window, realizing that sometimes the happiest endings do not begin with extraordinary moments at all. Sometimes they begin with two ordinary people discovering that home had been sitting beside them all along.